Chapter 8. One side of the McPhail shack had been blown in by the storm, and an oak tree lay across their doorway. So the McPhails stayed with the Hamiltons, and Andy and his father helped clean up the hill. Then one morning at dawn, Uncle John Hamilton and the McPhails left to cross the mountains. The whole eastern half of the sky was aglow with a pink and gold sunrise as Anne stood on the road, waving. Somehow she felt that she was saying goodbye to more than Uncle John and the McPhails. She was saying goodbye all over again to Margaret, to a visit and a dream. She was saying goodbye to the summer, too. Travel on the road was all one way now, from west to east. New settlers striking west for the first time would not be using the road again until spring. Although it was only in the middle of September, Anne could already feel the loneliness of winter creeping up the sides of the hill. She kept waving for a moment, even after the road was empty. It was not until she got back to the cabin that she discovered the letters scratched in the dirt by the door. Andy must have written them when she wasn't looking. Look under the step. There was a small opening at the back of the cabin step. Anne got down on her knees and reached her hand into the opening, feeling the ground in all directions. Her arm was in almost up to her elbow when her fingers touched a package of some kind. Anne drew it out. It was a small bundle, wrapped roughly in old brown paper. As Anne turned the package over and began unfolding the paper, she wondered if Andy were playing some kind of last-minute trick. It would be just like him. Then the paper opened, and Anne drew in her breath sharply. There inside lay her diary. Beside it, there was a new deerskin cover made to fit over the old brown one. A piece of paper torn off a corner of the wrapping stuck out between the pages of the diary. On it, Andy had written in smudged charcoal, "I took your diary when I was mad." So Andy had taken it, and all the time she had been blaming David. She thought back and began to understand. Andy had been spying on her when she stamped out his letters, and after she'd gone off, he must have come out of hiding and taken the diary from the steps. Anne fitted the new deerskin cover over the diary. It was very handsome, made from the soft underpart of a deer's skin, where the brown shades into a honey color. It looked like a real frontier diary now, Anne thought as she stroked it. She began to turn the pages over, rereading parts she had written. All at once it struck her that on the inside her diary wasn't much like a frontier diary. For the first time she noticed that she had hardly written anything about the western country. Most of her entries were about Gettysburg, about Margaret, about her homesickness. If any outsider were to pick up this diary and read it, he might not even know where it had been written. She turned the pages more slowly. She had never mentioned what Hamilton Hill looked like. Anne jumped up. She didn't want to think about Hamilton Hill now. She didn't care if her diary did have a handsome new cover. She didn't feel one bit like writing in it. She went inside the cabin and put the diary up on her shelf. All day long, as Anne went about her chores, she felt out of sorts and out of courage. It wasn't only that the McPhails had gone east while she was staying behind. She didn't know what was bothering her, but everything she did went wrong. She cut her finger when she was chopping pumpkin for her mother to make a pumpkin pie. She spilled half a pail of milk as she was taking lunch to the men in the field. She caught her dress on a prickly bush and tore it. And every time she picked up the baby, he cried. "This just isn't your day," her mother said toward the middle of the afternoon. "Why don't you go down the road and try to find some grapes? You'll like that. But mind you don't go too far." It certainly wasn't her day. Anne thought crossly as she took an empty pail and went out the cabin door. But when she reached the road, she wondered. Maybe, after all, something might yet turn her day around. Turn the day her way. The road seemed to have more magic to it than she had ever known. The sun's rays slanted down on it, as though they were lighting up a stage where something important was going to happen. There was a difference in the mood of the road. It wasn't a happy dancing mood or a mysterious moonlight mood. Today there was a grandness to the road, as though it were a carpet unfurling over the hill before some glorious secret. As Anne stood in the middle of the road, holding her pail in front of her, 2 golden leaves drifted down, turning slowly over and over in the air and settled in the bottom of her pail. A wild goose dipped low, honking from the sky, like a herald sent ahead with news. Anne walked down the hill, captured by the spell of the road. As she rounded each bend, she found herself half expecting something wonderful to be waiting on the other side. She didn't know what, but something. From time to time, she stopped to pick grapes that had survived the storm. On all the hill, the only sounds were the plopping of grapes in her pail and the occasional long honk of a passing goose. Anne followed the road as it wound its way down the hill, turning corner after corner, looking for grapes, but secretly hoping for something she couldn't even put into words. Her pail was almost full when she suddenly noticed where she was. She was almost to the bottom of the hill, almost to the spot David had pointed out as the site for the first church. She had let the road lead her farther than she had ever gone alone. Instead of something wonderful lying around the next corner of the road, there was probably something dreadful. And then Anne heard hoofbeats. They were coming from the east. Not just one horse, but 3 or 4. They were not far away. Anne ducked down behind some tall grass by the side of the road and made herself into the smallest ball she could possibly squeeze herself into, wrapping her arms tightly around her knees. She held her breath as the first horse rounded the bend of the road. She must not move, not even a finger. She kept her eyes on the road, counting the legs of the horses as they came into sight. Now there were 2 horses, 3, 4. If 4 men were traveling together from the east to the west at this time of year, they were probably not settlers. They were likely up to no good. They must be the Doane gang that Anne had warned her about. All at once, Anne began to tremble all over. The first horse stopped on the road in front of her. Then the other horses came to a stop. As Anne peeped through between the tall grasses, all she could see was a forest of horse legs. From some place way up high above the legs of the first horse came a deep voice. "Little girl," it said, "I wonder if you could tell me what your mother is having for dinner tonight." The voice didn't sound like the voice of a horse thief. Slowly, Anne lifted her eyes up from the legs of the horse to the boots of the rider. Slowly she lifted them to the place where the voice had come from. Then she found herself looking into the most wonderful face she had ever seen. It was a strong face, kind and good, and there was something strangely familiar about it. It was as if Anne ought to know this man, as if she almost knew him. No matter what David had said about strangers, somehow Anne knew deep inside he hadn't been talking about this one. She stopped feeling afraid. She stood up. "My mother is having peas and potatoes and cornbread for our evening meal," she said, "and she's baking pumpkin pie." The man smiled. He leaned down toward Anne. "Would you tell her," he said, "that General George Washington would like to take supper with her?" For a moment, Anne could not believe her ears. General George Washington on Hamilton Hill? Then all at once she knew it was true. The way she had pictured General George Washington, from what Arthur Scott had said about him. This was the way she had pictured George Washington from what Arthur Scott had said about him. This must have been just how Washington looked, riding among the men at Valley Forge. Suddenly, Arthur Scott's words flashed into her mind. "He always seemed to be there just when our courage began to peter out." Anne swallowed hard. She tried to drop a curtsy, but it turned out to be just a stiff little bob. She tried to find her voice, but it didn't turn out any better than the curtsy. It was more like a squeak. "My mother will be pleased," she said. "I'll tell her." Then Anne found herself and her pail of grapes up on the saddle in front of one of the men in General Washington's party. He said he was Dr. Craik, a friend of the general's, but Anne didn't pay much attention. She didn't even look at the other men. All she could see was a white horse in front of her and the straight back of General Washington going up Hamilton Hill. The road itself seemed almost to be moving them up the hill in a kind of magic dream. Except it wasn't a dream, Anne reminded herself. It was true, gloriously, wonderfully true. For some unbelievable reason, General George Washington was on the western side of the mountains, and he was going to have supper on Hamilton Hill. Suddenly, Anne turned to Dr. Craik. "Why did General Washington come here?" she asked. "He owns land in this country," Dr. Craik replied. "He's come to check on it." "He owns land here, in Washington County?" Anne repeated. Dr. Craik smiled. "Yes, he can't move here, but he bought land because he believes in this part of the country. Someday this land will be worth a great deal of money. He wants to do all he can to develop this side of the mountains." Anne fell silent, her eyes on General Washington. Again she pictured him at Valley Forge. A lot of people didn't believe in a free and independent country, she thought, but Washington had. And now he believed in the Western country. It wasn't just fathers and brothers and settlers who believed in it and owned land here. George Washington did too. Anne and Dr. Craik jogged up the hill. The other man called back and forth to each other, but Anne didn't hear them. Afterward, Anne could never remember just how she introduced General Washington and his friends to her mother. When she caught her breath again, they had started on a tour of the farm with David. Anne and her mother were alone in the cabin with supper to prepare. Mrs. Hamilton's eyes were shining as she stepped away from the door. "Now is the time to use the linen tablecloth, Anne, and the lavender-flowered plates." Anne was standing in the doorway, her head in the clouds, watching the men put up their horses. At her mother's words, she came quickly down to the world. What a wonderful world it was, she thought, as she flew over to her mother's chest for the linen tablecloth. "The food is almost ready," Mrs. Hamilton said. "I'll take care of that while you set the table." Anne spread out the white linen tablecloth on the table. She smoothed it gently over the rough boards. She pulled it to hang even on all sides. She unwrapped the nine flowered plates and placed them around the table. She put knives, forks, and spoons at each place and set new tall candles in the center of the table. Then Anne stepped back to look at what she had done. Somehow the whole room seemed changed. It seemed larger and more dignified. The clothes hanging awkwardly on hooks along the wall drew back into the shadows. All the light from the fire in the open doorway fell on the gleaming white party table, waiting for General Washington. "It's more beautiful than any table we ever set in Gettysburg," Anne whispered. Mrs. Hamilton looked up from the hearth and smiled. Later, the table looked even more wonderful, piled high with steaming food. Yellow hot cornbread, round bowls of green peas, roasted brown potatoes, a platter of cold venison, bowls of purple grape jelly, golden pumpkin pies. It was the same meal that they had nearly every evening all summer on Hamilton Hill. But tonight, with the lavender-flowered plates, it managed to look different. "I hope I look different, too," Anne thought as she fingered her two blue hair ribbons and hastily tied the sash of a fresh apron. She felt different. General Washington and Mr. Hamilton led the others into the cabin, and suddenly Anne felt herself feeling strangely shy. All the time they were taking their places at the table, she kept her eyes down. It was not until her father was asking the blessing that she stole her first look up from under half-closed eyelashes. When she saw George Washington's head bowed over the white tablecloth and lavender plate, the peas and potatoes, Anne thought she could hardly bear her happiness. During the rest of the meal, Anne followed the conversation in a kind of daze. She didn't seem to hear anything that anyone said except General Washington. Everything he said rang out with a special meaning, it almost seemed, just for her. "If I were a young man," General Washington said, "preparing to begin the world, I know of no country where I should rather live. I am determined to find a way," he said again, "that we can join the waters of the West with those of the East, so that the two countries may be close together." Anne held on to every word, turning them over in her mind, locked them away in her heart. It was after the evening meal, after all the thank yous had been said, and General Washington and his party were preparing to leave, that he said that he said what Anne was to treasure forever afterward. He stood in the doorway, looking toward the west, his eyes resting on Hamilton Hill, yet somehow going beyond. "The future is traveling west with people like you," he said to Mr. Hamilton. "Here's the rising world, to be kept or lost in the same way a battlefield is to be kept or lost." General Washington turned to Anne and put his hand gently on her shoulder. Through the courage of young girls as much as anyone's, you will live to see this whole country a rolling farmland, bright with houses and barns and churches. Some day. I envy you, Miss Hamilton. Anne felt her heart turning over within her. Even after General Washington had gone, she went on standing in the doorway, still feeling his hand on her shoulder. She looked out on Hamilton Hill. It seemed to her she had never seen it so beautiful. The trees more stately, the sky closer. She remembered the tea party she and her mother had had in the woods. The hill had been lovely that day, too. And of course, the part of the hill that went up and down with the road had always been wonderful. Anne looked at her vegetable garden, laid flat by the storm. It seemed to her that again she could feel the rain beating down on her and her peas. She could feel her own helplessness and despair as the vines broke all around her. She had to fish pods out from the muddy water. Suddenly, Anne knew what she had not known before. She had cried during the storm, but it was not really because she hated the Western country. It was because she loved her vegetable garden. Other thoughts began crowding in on Anne almost faster than she could take care of them. Maybe she had begun to love Hamilton Hill, too, without even knowing it. Perhaps that was the one reason her thoughts had been so mixed up, and she hadn't asked if she could go to the east. She could go east. Anne lifted her chin. Well, she was going to plant another vegetable garden in the spring. It was important for her to do it. She was important to the Western country. George Washington had said so. And someday, she thought. Anne caught herself and smiled. Here she was, thinking someday just like the others. David, coming back from the road and seeing General Washington off, caught Anne's smile. "Here's something else for you to smile about," he said. He pulled a small packet of letters from his pockets and fingered through them. Dr. Craik was given these letters at Devore's Ferry to bring on to us. They had been left there about a week ago. There's one for you. He handed Anne an envelope. It was a letter from Margaret. All the excitement and all the happiness of the long day seemed to rush into Anne's feet. She took the letter and she ran. Not because she wanted to get anywhere, but just because she had to run. Sometimes Anne had discovered there is only one thing to do about gladness, and that is to run. Her 2 brown braids and blue hair ribbons streamed behind her. She ran to the road, to the crest of the hill, where on one side the road dropped away to the west, and on the other side it dropped away to the east. Here Anne stopped to catch her breath. She sat down on a rock beside the road and slowly slit open the envelope of Margaret's letter. She didn't want to read it too fast. Letters didn't come often. She wanted to make this first reading last as long as she could. The sun seemed to follow the path of the road as it rolled west into the evening. Anne read about the new teacher in the Gettysburg School, about the frolic at the Gettysburg Hamiltons, and then she came to the last paragraph. "This is the big news," Margaret wrote. "At last I have persuaded Mother and Father to allow me to do what I have wanted to do for so long. They said that in the spring, when someone is going over the mountains, I may go along and spend the spring and summer with Uncle John and Aunt Mary. They have no children, and I am sure I could be a help. Just think how close I will be to you, and I will have a little part in the making of the Western country after all, even if it is only for one season." Anne put the letter down in her lap. She wasn't able to find any words to say, even to herself, all that she was feeling. She looked at the road, gathering up the shadows of the evening. Before her, in the distant dusk, She could just see the outline of the cabin. A thin spiral of smoke climbed up from the chimney and joined a gray cloud in the sky. My cup runneth over, Anne whispered to herself. That night, in the home of a Colonel Cannon, several miles west of Hamilton Hill, before he blew out his candle, General George Washington sat down at a table and wrote this in his diary. September 18th, 1784. Set out with Dr. Crick for my land on Miller's Run. Cross the Monongahela Gullah at Divorce Ferry, baited at one Hamilton's about 4 miles from it in Washington County, and lodged at Colonel Cannon's. That night in the cabin on Hamilton Hill, Anne took down from her shelf her deerskin-covered diary. Her heart was too full to write all that she wanted. Instead, she wrote in big letters across a whole page, September 18th, 1784. Washington was here. George Washington was here. In smaller letters underneath, she added, Margaret is coming. Tomorrow she would write more.